What if I told you the first murder in human history happened between two brothers? Not for power, not for money, not for revenge, but because of jealousy. One brother was loved by God, while the other allowed anger to consume his heart. And in a single moment of rage, humanity witnessed its very first murder. This is the shocking story of Cain and Abel, a story that reveals how jealousy, pride, and unchecked anger can destroy everything. And even thousands of years later, its warning still speaks to us today. After Adam and Eve disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, everything changed forever. The perfect world they once knew disappeared in a single moment. No more peace, no more perfection, no more walking freely with God in paradise. Outside the garden, life became difficult, painful, and uncertain. The ground was hard to work, the weather was harsh, and suffering had entered the human story for the very first time. Yet even in judgment, God still showed mercy. Adam and Eve were forced to leave Eden, but they were not abandoned. A new chapter for humanity was about to begin. As Adam and Eve began rebuilding their lives outside the garden, Eve gave birth to her first son. She named him Cain. To his parents, Cain represented hope in a broken world. After all the pain, shame, and loss they had experienced, this child brought them joy once again. Adam and Eve believed that perhaps their family could still have a future under God's mercy. Cain grew up surrounded by the stories of Eden, hearing about the paradise his parents once lived in and the consequences of disobedience. Later, Eve gave birth to another son named Abel. The two brothers grew up together side by side. They shared the same home, the same parents, and the same world outside Eden. As children, they likely laughed together, learned together, and depended on one another. But as the years passed, their personalities and hearts slowly began moving in very different directions. One brother would become remembered for faith and righteousness, while the other would become remembered for anger and destruction. As an adult, Cain chose the life of a farmer. Every day, he worked the ground beneath the burning sun, planting seeds and harvesting crops from the earth. Farming was difficult and exhausting work, especially in a world already cursed by sin. Cain became strong, hard-working, and determined. The fields became his responsibility and his identity. He depended completely on the land for survival, spending long days laboring to produce food. Abel chose a different path in life. Instead of farming, he became a shepherd who cared for sheep and livestock. Day after day, Abel guided his flock across peaceful hills and open fields. He learned patience, responsibility, and gentleness. Unlike Cain, Abel developed a humble spirit and sincere devotion toward God. His quiet life among the sheep shaped his character, teaching him trust, obedience, and faith. One day, the time came for both brothers to bring offerings before God. In those days, offerings were deeply meaningful acts of worship. People offered sacrifices to honor God, express gratitude, and demonstrate their faith. This moment was not simply about presenting gifts. It was about the condition of the heart behind the offering. Both Cain and Abel approached God that day, but their hearts were very different. Cain gathered fruits and crops from the fields he had worked so hard to cultivate. On the surface, his offering may have appeared acceptable. He had clearly invested time, energy, and labor into producing it. But God does not only look at outward actions. He sees the heart behind them. Somewhere within Cain's spirit, true devotion and genuine faith were missing. His offering reflected duty, but not complete surrender to God. Abel approached God differently. He carefully selected the firstborn and finest portions from his flock. Abel did not offer leftovers or something ordinary. He gave his very best to God because his sacrifice came from sincere faith and love. His worship was genuine, humble, and wholehearted. Abel understood that honoring God required more than outward action. It required complete trust and devotion from the heart. Then came the moment that changed human history forever. God accepted Abel's offering with favor, but Cain's offering was rejected. Instantly, Cain's emotions began to spiral. Shock turned into disappointment. Disappointment turned into anger. and anger slowly transformed into jealousy. Instead of reflecting on his own heart, Cain focused on his brother. The seed of bitterness had now entered his soul. Cain became consumed by frustration and resentment. His face reflected the darkness growing inside him. Rather than asking God what he needed to change, Cain allowed jealousy to control his thoughts. Every time he looked at Abel, he was reminded that God had accepted his brother but rejected him. The more Cain focused on his anger, the more dangerous his emotions became. But before tragedy struck, God lovingly warned Cain. God asked him why he was angry and explained that sin was waiting at his door like a predator ready to attack. Cain still had a choice. He could repent, change his attitude, and master the darkness growing inside him. God was giving him an opportunity to stop before it was too late. But Cain refused to listen. Instead of humbling himself before God, Cain chose to hold onto his anger. Jealousy slowly poisoned every part of his thinking. Rather than correcting his own heart, he blamed his brother for his pain. The warning God had given him was ignored, and the power of sin continued growing stronger inside him with every passing moment. One day, Cain invited Abel to walk with him into the field. Abel trusted his brother completely and followed him without fear. He had no idea that Cain's heart had already become consumed by hatred. What appeared to be an ordinary walk between brothers was actually leading toward one of the darkest moments in human history. Then, in a moment of uncontrolled rage, Cain attacked Abel and killed him. In that lonely field, humanity witnessed its very first murder. One brother took the life of another because jealousy had fully taken control of his heart. Sin, which had started as anger and resentment, had now led to irreversible destruction. After the attack, silence filled the field. Cain stood there surrounded by the terrible reality of what he had done. The weight of guilt and horror began settling over him. Humanity had crossed a tragic line for the very first time. Violence, hatred, and death had now entered human history through the actions of one jealous heart. Then God spoke to Cain once again, asking him, "Where is your brother Abel?" God already knew the truth, but he gave Cain another opportunity to confess and take responsibility for his actions. Even after such a terrible sin, God still offered Cain a chance to respond honestly. But Cain refused to confess. Instead, he answered with arrogance and dishonesty, saying, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Those words revealed how deeply sin had hardened his heart. The jealousy that began inside him had now destroyed not only his brother's life, but also his own integrity and relationship with God. Nothing can ever be hidden from God. God declared that Abel's blood cried out from the ground itself. Cain's crime had been fully exposed before heaven. The consequences of his actions could no longer be avoided. Justice would now follow the terrible choices he had made. God punished Cain by cursing the ground beneath him. The land he once depended on for survival would no longer produce crops properly for him. Cain, the farmer, would now become a restless wanderer across the earth. He would spend the rest of his life carrying the burden of guilt, separation, and the consequences of his sin. Even after Cain committed such a terrible crime, God still showed mercy. Cain feared that someone would eventually kill him in revenge. But God placed a protective mark upon Cain so no one would harm him. It was a reminder that even in judgment, God's mercy still existed. Cain would live with consequences, but his life would be spared. The story of Cain and Abel continues to speak powerfully to humanity thousands of years later. It reminds us that jealousy, anger, pride, and unchecked sin can destroy lives. Cain's downfall did not begin in the field where Abel died. It began much earlier inside his heart. But the story also teaches us about faith, humility, obedience, and sincere worship. Every human being faces the same choice even today, whether to allow darkness to control the heart or choose the path that leads closer to God.